This two-part lecture is about neuroscience. Neuroscience is basically what happens when we apply the principles of biology to psychology. So this is thinking about behavior from a molecular level, thinking about things like cells. So first I want to start talking about the setup of the nervous system. So the nervous system breaks off into lots of different branches. The first break is between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system are the nerves that run throughout your body everywhere except in your brain and spinal cord. Those neurons or those nerves are the central nervous system, and that will be the central theme of the second portion of this lecture. So let's focus on the peripheral nervous system now. This breaks off into two parts: the autonomic nervous system, which controls things that you can't control. So for example, things like your heart beating. Somatic nervous system is stuff that you do control. So as you move your hand to write or click the mouse, that is using your somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system breaks down one more time into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is what is active when you have a fight or flight response. It prepares you for action. The parasympathetic nervous system is what is active when you are calm or your body is at rest. So the nervous system is made up of trillions of neurons, and a neuron is essentially another way of calling a nerve cell. The interconnections between these neurons, and there are many, many of them in your body and in your brain, that's called your nervous system. So there are three major types of neurons, and these can be found in lots of different parts of the body. The first kind are sensory neurons. Sensory neurons are neurons that bring information in to the brain or into the body from the environment. So for example, when you touch the mouse on your computer, you can feel it, and the reason you can feel it is because there are sensory neurons in your finger that are bringing that information in, and it actually some sensory neurons go all the way up into your brain, or a series of neurons go up into your brain to take that information there. The motor neurons are the neurons that cause you to move or to act. So if you were to write down the word the muscles in your arm have to move to make that sequence of letters, and the neurons, the motor neurons, are what causes that to happen. And then there's interneurons found largely in your brain, some in your spinal cord. And these are the connections between the sensory neurons and the motor neurons, because the sensory neurons bring the information in. The interneurons make decisions about what should happen, what actions the body should take, and then once the decision is made, it's sent out to engage in action via the motor neurons. So this is one single neuron up close, and I'm going to point out some of the major parts. So the first thing that we see that's highlighted is the cell body, and I'm not that interested in this for our class. What I am interested in is other parts. The first are the dendrites, and the dendrites are these tree-like structures that surround the cell body, and the job of a dendrite is to bring information in from the neuron next to it. So between your hand and your brain there are hundreds of thousands of neurons, and they all are involved in sending information into your brain and then back out into your body. So they basically are stacked up one against each other, and the dendrites on each of those neurons bring information in. Then you have an axon, which is this long tail, and the axon's job is to send information out of the neuron down to the next neuron. At the very end of the axon, we have what we refer to frequently as terminal branches, but really this is just an extension of the axon. So the terminal branches of one axon will talk to or be connected with, largely connected with, the dendrites of the next neuron. Then we have these little bumps here that look like water wings that run down the axis. These are actually fatty modules, and they're called myelin sheath. And a myelin sheath is there to help information move more quickly down the axon, because the more quickly information moves in our nervous system, the better we are in terms of our ability to react to the environment. So these help information go faster. So this is another picture that kind of shows how one neuron can talk to the other neuron. So you see up in the upper right corner we have the cell body of one neuron. There's some dendrites and then an axon kind of going down towards the bottom left corner. And that axon is attached to the dendrites of the next neuron down. And in the bottom right hand corner you can see a blow up of the little area where the axon of the first neuron is attached or talking to the dendrites of the second neuron. And you can see up close that there's actually a little bit of a space there. That's called the synapse. So it's not the case that neurons actually touch one another. They don't. There's a little tiny space in between the axon of one and the dendrite of the next. And what's going to happen in this space is this is where we're going to find neurotransmitters. So how is it that we learn? Well, our neurons talk to each other. So as we interact with the environment, we go to class, we learn new skills, we find directions to a new restaurant, we tasted food for the first time. All of these are learning, and it happens by neural communication. So at any given point in life, you have millions and millions of neurons talking to each other all the time. They're fundamentally responsible for everything you think, everything you feel, and everything you do. Synaptogenesis is how this happens when we learn something new. So when we learn something new, neurons will talk to each other for the first time. That's synaptogenesis. What happens here then is it's creation of synapses. So genesis means creation. Synapto refers to synapse. So the more we learn, the more connections we build between neurons. And intelligence is not really about how many neurons you have. It's about how many connections between neurons you have. So the more connections you can build, the better. So if you're always challenging yourself to learn new things or try new things, you'll always be developing new synapses, and that's the process of synaptogenesis. There's also this idea of plasticity. Our brains are really fantastic, the human brain, and it has the ability to change based on the experiences it has in the environment, which is really useful. This is what we refer to as plasticity, the ability for connections for the brain to change. So in order for neurons to communicate with one another once that connection has been made, there's two paths of communication, and both are required. You can't do one or the other. You have to have both of them. The first one we'll talk about is electrical communication, which is what happens within a singular neuron, and the second one is chemical communication, which is what happens between neurons. So let's start with the electrical communication. The electrical signal that neurons send within themselves are called action potentials, and essentially you can think of this as a brief electrical charge. It goes anywhere from 2 to 200 miles per hour down that axon, so it's very quick. And of course, the myelin is what makes it go faster. So if an axon has a lot of myelin, it'll go the 200 plus miles per hour. If it has less, it'll be slower. So this action potential, this electrical signal, it works on an all or nothing process. So there's something called the action potential threshold. Basically what that means is that there's a certain amount of stimulation that needs to be brought in from the other neuron. So the dendrite needs to bring in a certain amount of stimulation in order for the electrical signal or the action potential to be sent down the axon to the next neuron. And this is an all or nothing process. So there's a threshold that has to be met. If it's not met, the signal stops, it dies. If the signal, the threshold is met, then the signal will be sent on to the next neuron. So think for a moment about what it feels like if you were to stroke your face lightly. Maybe you can go ahead and actually do that. And you feel a little bit of a touch, but it's nothing like what would happen if you felt a punch across your face. So the question here from a neuron perspective is it the case that a stroke and a punch feel different because there are fewer neurons firing in a stroke than in a punch, or is it the case that the neurons are just firing more lightly when you're stroking your face versus when you're getting punched in the face? And the answer is there's simply fewer neurons. The reason it's not the case that the neurons are getting activated more lightly is that, remember, it's an all or nothing process. Neurons don't fire at different levels. They only fire at one level. So when you're touching your face softly, fewer neurons are reaching the potential, the action potential threshold, and getting sent to your brain than when you get punched. When you get punched, there's a lot of neurons that get enough stimulation to send the information. So remember, this is an all or nothing process. So now let's talk about the chemical communication. So remember that the electrical communication is within a neuron, chemical communication is between neurons, and this is where we're going to talk about neurotransmitters. And a neurotransmitter is the chemical message that communicates between neurons. So one neuron sends neurotransmitters to the next neuron, and that's how they communicate. So this is another diagram that shows that synapse. So in the top half of this picture, we have the axon end, and then we have the beginning of the dendrite of the next cell, and then there's that space in between called the synapse. And what you can see is that there's little pockets of dots, and those are neurotransmitter chemicals. So when the electrical signal comes down the axon, it causes the axon end or the axon button to spit out all of this neurotransmitter, and that neurotransmitter floats around in the synapse. What happens then is that the dendrite of the next cell will suck up as much of that neurotransmitter as possible. Once it gets enough, once it meets the action potential threshold, it will cause the electrical signal within itself to go down its own axon, which will release more neurotransmitter, which will get sucked up by the next dendrite and cause another electrical signal, and so on and so forth. So the way neurons talk to one another is electrical, chemical, electrical, chemical, electrical, chemical, all the way from the point of maybe you touching something with your skin to the information actually making it to your brain, which is hundreds of thousands of neurons. That was an entirely electrical, chemical process. So a few specific neurotransmitters to note. One is called acetylcholine, and this is a neurotransmitter that is being used in your body when you do muscle actions. It's also what you use to help you form memories. There's dopamine, which is involved in movement and attention and emotion. So something like Parkinson's disease is a muscle movement issue, and that's caused by inappropriate functioning within the dopamine receptors in the body, or not having enough dopamine. There's serotonin, which is involved in our mood. It's involved in our ability to sleep or be awake, and it's also involved in our appetite. Maybe at Thanksgiving you feel sleepy and you've heard that that's because there's something called tryptophan in your turkey. Well, tryptophan is actually one of the things that makes serotonin. So when you have lots of tryptophan, they argue that your body will create more serotonin, and that's what makes you sleepy. Serotonin is one of the chemicals that often gets off balance in depression, which is why it changes your mood, it changes your sleeping patterns, and it changes your eating habits. Then there's epinephrine, which we often refer to as adrenaline. Adrenaline or epinephrine is what causes the body to go into fight or flight response. This is also something that's released when we're stressed out, and we'll spend some time talking about stress later in the semester. And then there's endorphins. Endorphins come from the term endogenous morphine. Endogenous means natural to. So this is basically a chemical that our body naturally makes that's like morphine. And morphine, of course, is a painkiller. So this elevates our mood and eases our pain. This is something that's released when we do have pain, when we have an injury. So if you've ever been in sports and you've played in a game where you've rolled your ankle, but you're able to play through it, and then it hurts like the dickens the next day, that's because of endorphins. The endorphins allowed you to play through it. This is also going to be released when you exercise, which is why exercising is so important for us to feel good, because it elevates our mood to have endorphins, and exercise is one of the ways that endorphins get into our system. So I just want to really quickly point out that a vast majority of the medications and drugs out there are actually mimicking neurotransmitters, natural neurotransmitters. So morphine was one example. Morphine is a synthetic version of the endorphins. There's another one that's called L-DOPA, and L-DOPA is a treatment for Parkinson's patients. And you can see here in the brain scans that the two brains on the top are from a normal patient. The second set of brain scans are from a person who has Parkinson's disease without having taken this L-DOPA, and then below it's the same brain after having taken the L-DOPA. And when you look at brain scans, areas that are highlighted are the areas where there's the most activity. So here the places that are red and yellow are places where there's the most activity. Places where there's blue or purple are the places where there's least activity. So you can see that the person who has Parkinson's had deflated activity, less activity than normal before taking this medication. And then L-DOPA is a synthetic form of dopamine, which we just learned is responsible for motor movement, that once that was in the system, the brain was showing higher amounts of activation. And it's not perfectly matched in the normal brain, as you can see, but at least it's better than it was before the medication. And that's what the effort is to try and do, is to try to override neurotransmitters in the body that aren't working. And this is one of the things that you'll find in a lot of different kinds of medications out there. So in part 2, we will talk about the brain and the central nervous system.